Here we are again, very long 2.5 hours of continuing onwards. Plan for this week, I'm getting you a study guide by Thursday for an exam that we're going to take a week from Thursday. There is the ongoing assignment that is due on Thursday. Depending on how productive we are today, we might get to the point where I can assign the second project. The second project will not be anywhere near as complicated or as difficult as this first one. I'm trying to at least alternate between the levels of danger.
Danger to your own life or what? Like, what do you mean danger?
It's an umbrella term. If you can think of how that might apply, the answer is it probably applies.
Okay, good.
So you can imagine that the next one is coming fairly soon. If not, if we don't get there today to start thinking about it, then you'll probably see it on Thursday. I won't officially assign it until that point anyway. And I know that there will also be studying for an exam that is happening throughout that time as well. So I will take that into account when I try to figure out when it should be due. And if you find yourself having to prioritize getting the assignment done or studying for the exam, let me know. And I will try to
You'll know when you're
reschedule around making sure that you have the ability to be successful with both. Again, first time teaching a class, a lot of the time I make a best estimate, and those estimates can be horribly wrong because I have no data to go based on, to go on. So data is useful always. Last time we were talking about adversarial search. So we went over minimax, alpha, beta, applications to some games, some ideas of applications and how that might be relevant to cyber. But we have a bit of that to finish off. And then we're going to go into constraint solving as the next chapter, because constraints are a significant wrench, and knowing how to phrase a question in terms of the associated constraints and solve a problem based on those constraints has very wide applicability to literally everything. So whatever it is that you're trying to get out of this course, or however you're trying to apply it, the constraint solving portion of it will be used in some way, shape, or form in your professional life. So we had talked about, I think we ended here by talking about how Stockfish works on Chess AI, being able to look ahead about 30 moves, which is pretty incredible. But note that that's still not perfect, because if a game lasts 50 moves, then even looking ahead 30 moves isn't necessarily, it can still suffer from some of what we talked about last time with the horizon effect, and the very next move past that can be garbage. Or you might have identified a particular set of moves that optimizes for that, and we have the concept of a doomed unit, that you sacrifice 2 pawns to protect, but it's still doomed at the end of that window. There's just no way for the agent or the system to know about that. So factoring that into your analysis of if there's some way to know that what it is that you're trying to protect is still doomed and you're sacrificing resources to protect that doomed entity, then it's worth just letting go of that entity and focusing your time and energy elsewhere. Any other questions about anything before we soldier on to new content? I should be. Yes, we are recording. Whether that recording has sound. Have people verified that things posted fairly recently, somewhat recently, have sound? That is so weird that one instance didn't. It was the first one, so it is odd. All right, onwards. We're going to talk about Monte Carlo tree search, and we'll dive into Monte Carlo a little bit more as we start talking about probabilistic analysis and how to learn from the data that you get. But for now, it's worth talking about just in terms of chess isn't actually that complicated of a game, and especially compared to the applications that you're going to be seeing in cyber, the games that you would play in cyber are going to be more complicated than chess. There's a wider branching factor. You're considering way more resources, and the attack patterns on those resources are more complicated than they are in chess. In fact, it probably maps better onto Go than it does onto chess. Familiarity with the board game Go? Just knowing the basic rules of it, or generally how it's played is good enough. But the branching factor of Go starts at 361 instead of the average that was in chess, about 35. So significant branching factor, that's the base of the exponent for the length of the game, and Go has more moves to it than chess does. So 361 is the base of a larger exponent. It just means that the search space is even more massive. It's also way harder to analyze your state in Go, because it might look like from a local perspective that you have some kind of trap set up and you're a couple of moves away from completing that trap and gaining some space inside of that, unless you have a wider view and see the trap that's about to happen to you to gain all of that space that you've been spending so many resources trying to set up. That is a major factor in Go. So the actual position, you can see very wide swings in the position of Go. So it makes it an even more difficult game to look ahead at and see. So from my perspective, I see the cyber world and the cyber problems that you see adversarially a lot more like Go, where the branching factor is larger and you don't necessarily know the state that you are in until you get one piece of information that reveals a whole bunch and completely changes your strategy, your view of what's happening at the local level. So what looks good to even a robust evaluation function can swing drastically. A move or two later, it looks like the game is headed in a completely different direction. Unless you have the ability to look out that far and see, but because the search space is so large, it's harder to do. So instead, rather than trying to use what we have talked about so far, which requires an entire understanding of the entire search space, what are the values going to be at the terminal nodes in a alpha beta search? Instead, we don't even really have a heuristic evaluation function. Be able to say, here's how good we think it's going to be at the end of the game. You have to approximate it from experience. So you're going to start simulating the games starting from the current state, and however much time you have for evaluation, you're just going to start simming and using the best tools that you have to figure out what could happen from here. Using that as data, you can now backtrack to the current position and have an informed decision about what action you can take to get you in a better state for the future. And this is very useful in extremely large search space environments. Of course, the real world isn't played out randomly. So even in a game, you can't just simulate like your opponent is going to play randomly. You have to have some way of determining what is my opponent most likely to do when I do that. So you can learn some kind of policy that biases the moves that the AI would make, in this case, to something that is good, by some definition of good. And that's going to, of course, be problem dependent, environment dependent. But if you have some way of learning some kind of approximate policy, you can start to make better decisions because you're simulating a more intelligent opponent. And just let the law of large numbers kick in and say that the 80 times I visited this state, I was in a better position to win than I was the 40 times that I visited this state. And even that is more information than nothing. This often gets paired with some techniques that we'll go into when we start talking about supervised learning, so that you can learn things like abstract strategies. And that way you don't have to hard code the good strategy, you just feed it into a deep net. And the deep net learns the strategy to employ against you so that you maximize the value of the data that you're collecting. We'll talk about that. I don't know if we'll get to quite that level of depth in this class, but I'm designing some courses with Stu that would go into that level of detail to try to figure out, okay, how can we simulate a real adversary. How can we use a deep net to train an adversary? And then what are the shortcomings that you would have? What do you need to keep in mind, and the differences between a deep net simulated adversary and a real adversary? Questions on anything here? Very important part of this is figuring out when do we go into this concept of starting to use the end of game simulation, where we can store some moves, or we can start to simulate to the end of the game. Because if you're at the very beginning of the game, there are so many paths through the game that you're going to need a sample size that is so large to make even a remotely informed decision that you might want to tackle the problem from a different perspective. So one way to do this, start by using N simulations, where N is just, there are ways to figure that out. But starting from the current state, tracking which move leads to the highest winning percentage. And are you exploring the entire state space? Absolutely not unless you're playing tic-tac-toe, but you're getting some experience with the remainder of the state space. And if there is one state that is significantly better than the others, that will start to play out, assuming that you have a reasonable agent to play against that's not making completely random moves, but is making somewhat intelligent moves. You can imagine that if you can immediately capture a queen in chess with no repercussions, that regardless of what happens from there, more often than not, you're going to find yourself in a significantly better position. So you can identify that that is the next good move to make, even if there are 20 moves or so until the end of the game, and you can only explore a few of those paths in that very large search space. That move is so good, even at distance one, that you can identify that just through the experience that you get. For some games, this will start to lead to optimal play, but usually not sufficient because just the search space is too large. It's especially true as well for events that have very low or high probability. You end up needing to get a larger and larger sample to get a reasonable expected value for your simulation to match the expected value. Imagine something like playing the lottery. What is the expected value of playing the lottery? It's negative, but it's not zero. But until you imagine, if this is just the moderate prizes stripped out, you either lose or you win a jackpot. Until you win that jackpot, depending on how long that takes, your expected value just through experience is 0, 0, 0, 0, because you've never won anything. So if you play the lottery 100 times or 1,000 times and use that as a simulation for the expected value, because the probability is so low, it is unlikely that your experience so far is going to approximate that. You either haven't seen a jackpot, in which case you're vastly underestimating the expected value, or if you see a jackpot in the first 100 times you play it, you're going to be vastly overestimating the expected value because you were lucky and hit a jackpot early. You don't have a large enough sample to have that spread out over time, and it would take millions of samples in order to approximate the actual expected value of such an unlikely event. So the example that I like to use is flipping a coin where the outcome is equally likely. How much experience do you need to hone in on the probability of the coin landing heads is 50%. Significantly less experience than you need to figure out the associated expected value of the lottery. So the closer you are to even likelihood, the less experience you need. The farther away from that you are, the more extreme the event, the more experience you need to be able to have a surety that you're reasonably representing it. So to be able to improve on this, what we need to do is we need to be able to hone in on parts of the search tree that we don't have information on, or that might make an important distinction between making a move or not making a move. So we're not going to treat everything as equally likely. We're going to have some kind of priority for, all right, we're going to force the opponent to move as such so that we end up in this portion of the search tree so we can get information about it to determine how good it is to be there. All right, it's terrible. All right, we'll throw it out. We'll see this also when we come back and talk about reinforcement learning in a little bit more depth. Sorry, Eric. The one person in here who's seen and done that. I'll apologize to you more later. But yeah, we see this fluctuation in priority between exploring things that we haven't seen before and exploiting the moves that we have seen that seem to work well. If you have a process that seems to be working well, but you have a small sample on that, you can get a lot of information from continuing to explore that to say, is it as good as it looks like from the small sample that we have, versus should I be trying something that I haven't tried before, hoping to the best set of moves that I've found so far. So yeah, we'll do a deep dive into reinforcement learning algorithms eventually. State of the art utilizes an algorithm called upper confidence bound applied to trees, utilizing the upper confidence bound 1 algorithm. I can talk about that in more detail as well, but for now it's just kind of a dead end that we'll explore later. Questions on modeling this as kind of as a search in a tree that is a massive space that we cannot hope to reasonably approximate the values of at the end of it, but we can utilize some experience, especially intelligent searching in that space, to get experience in relevant areas, to give us the information that we need to make the decisions that will be useful. That's a mouthful, even as a summary. Oh yeah, I threw this random fact into this slide as well. I actually did my PhD qualifying exam on the research paper that introduced UCB1 and UCT. So I know quite a bit about it.
It's a qualifying exam. Thank you.
A disgusting procedure that ruins your mental health for the rest of your life.
Oh, all right.
All right, it's worth 1 minute of our time. On Thursday night, this is while you're taking classes, by the way. On Thursday night, you receive 2 to 3 recently published state-of-the-art papers in an area of your interest. Tuesday morning, you submit about a 20 to 30 page single-space report dictating or summarizing the entirety of the state-of-the-art of that research, all the research that is related to, and how it all works. On Thursday, you get up in front of experts in the field and you give a 1-hour presentation as they attempt to rip you to shreds. And if you fail, you're done with your PhD. And if you succeed, you're allowed to continue torturing yourself until you get it.
Is that so heavy?
In other words, just don't have any responsibilities other than PhD.
Yeah, you absolutely cannot be doing anything on the side, but even the fact that you have classes that you're going to at that same time I mean, this is dense research material. This is like you're summarizing even a textbook that's trying to be coherent. This is graduate level pure math, and research papers are cramming 40 pages of explanation down into 6 pages of math. So trying to just understand, what is this math? What are you showing here that you don't have the space to explain at all? And sometimes you question whether the other authors of the paper understand it themselves, because it's just that dense. And going through the tree that is, this paper cites these papers, I'll read these papers, or cites these papers. You go through 50 papers over the course of that, trying to piece together, how did this idea come to be? You end up knowing that really well by the end of that, if you pass.
Did you just say your school got in the way of your school?
Yeah, it's a meta problem. And your classes are like, why aren't you attending? Why aren't you doing your homework?
That's kind of like the first homework assignment you did. It really got in the way of everything else.
Yeah.
I told Dr. Espinoza about that. He gave me an Einstein quote that was like, my education is getting in the way of learning, or something like that.
Yeah, right. My learning things is getting in the way of my learning things, just getting in the way of my free time. It just stacks more and more of that as you get higher up in education. It's like, all right, I can clear this roadblock, but it reveals this roadblock, which reveals this roadblock, which reveals my mental health.
Sorry to sidetrack.
Oh, yeah, you're good. I enjoy talking about it because it's kind of like every time David speaks. It's a great sidetrack. Points out the flaws of the entire system. So we're gonna dive into now a deeper dive on how this applies to stochastic games. Who knows or can remote recall what a stochastic process is? Or is this just a term that I'm throwing out there that no one's ever seen before?
Random, right?
Yeah, there's some kind of random or probabilistic process to it. Yeah, so as we throw probability into this, where now you're not necessarily guaranteed to end up at the state that you think you are, there's a distribution of states that you could end up in depending on this action. I talk about it because this is very relevant to cyber. You make an action against a threat and you don't know what state you're going to be in. Is the threat neutralized by the time you're done with that? Or have they had time to mess with you to some other extent to which something else is broken? Is this even going to work? Yes or no? You don't necessarily have full information in certain situations. So cyber, I see as a stochastic game. So you need to make decisions about what to do, knowing that there's a distribution of possible outcomes to the decision to take that action. So each action probabilistically leads to a set of potential successor states with certain probabilities. We can go into backgammon for this, but for something like on the turn after you roll, you know what all of your legal moves are, but that's dependent on what you roll. So you can make an intelligent selection given your roll, but you don't know what your future rolls are going to come up as. So you can make a decision now that makes it more likely that when you roll and reveal that uncertain future, that you can make an informed choice with this move. But that propagates to the next move, which propagates to the next move, to the next move. It's about how far ahead can you reasonably see a probabilistic tree in terms of, given all of that possible search space, what move should I make now that opens up future moves for me, given an unknown future roll. So yeah, you don't know what your opponent's gonna roll, how they're gonna block you, or what their legal moves are going to be when you make that decision, or what your future moves are going to be. But you could represent this as some kind of data structure utilizing some kind of probability tree. If you were able to represent that, then you could run a probabilistic analysis in ways that might inform the kind of move that you should make in the current state based on that information. What this looks like in terms of alpha beta search is that we're just going to add a chance layer between the max and min layers and the min and max layers. So every time a player acts, there's now a branch to the possible states that you might be in based on the outcome of that chance node. So you don't really have to change too much about the representation of the game or the system. You just have to model the probabilistic nature of moving from one state to the next. And you can think of it like a third player who acts with proportion to the probability that is given at that node. Questions on this representation, what the chance node represents, how this could be useful in modeling a stochastic situation? Yeah.
Not a question, I just have no idea what's going on, to be honest.
Okay.
It is.
Okay, so let's give you an example that might be relevant. So. Yeah. Connect four, sure. Whatever you place, let's say there's an associated chance. Well, it's still kind of, you know where that's going. We need some kind of random process. So a die roll, a coin flip, a idea.
Settlers of Catan.
Sure. Yeah, where you decide to place, I don't know if everyone's played Settlers of Catan, but where you place your base, whatever it is that creates resources and adjacent squares whenever you roll 2 dice and get that associated sum. So if you place yourself next to a 6 or an 8, because a 7 is defined for something else, it's more likely than placing yourself next to an 11 or a 12 or a 1 or a 2 or a 3. So coming up with a probabilistic analysis of I need a set of resources, but I also am more likely to get resources that roll closer to what two dice are expected to do. But I kind of want to make this simpler if possible. So something like I will grade this class based on some kind of random distribution. If you submit an assignment, I'm just going to accept it with 50% probability.
Nice.
Even if you submit it on time. But if you submit it on time, there's a 50% chance that I'm just gonna give you 100% and not look at it. And only with the remaining chance am I actually going to analyze it for its quality. So the decision that you would have to make at that is, do I even start the assignment? Because there's a chance if I submit something blank that it gets accepted and gets full credit. There's a chance if I do the work, it just gets rejected with no value to it. So how much effort should you put into that is going to depend on the associated distribution. And you can imagine that as that distribution changes, it affects whether you do the assignment at all and how much attention you give to that assignment.
So from my own understanding, relating that example to this graph,
Yeah,
that distribution would be like min or something, and then we are max, right? The two different players that.
Yeah.
Make the choices, okay.
yeah. And so that helps you to be able to make an informed decision because you can analyze the entire distribution of possible results.
Okay, so your opponents are other people turning in assignments,
Yeah,
that's. Okay.
but in this case, the policy is guaranteed. Imagine that my policy is also chance-based. The distribution that I choose is going to be based on something that is based on the proportion of students who submit their assignments. If enough of you submit your assignments, I'll grade them all. So now not doing the work is a risk that may affect you and the other agents in the system as well. So you'd incorporate that into your probabilistic analysis.
So something like liar's dice.
Yeah,
That kind of sounds like that example of the four-way graph of foot positions where someone tabbles.
yeah, it creates kind of a logical system, but you can also imagine this just in terms of how likely a particular event is to occur. You could have a very bad event with some likelihood, a very good event with some likelihood, a moderate event with some likelihood, and that helps you to figure out what action should I take, even though I could be in one of those three states, the bad outcome, the good outcome, or the moderate outcome with some associated probability. I have to make the decision about which action to take before I know what the outcome of that is going to be. So there is some uncertainty with regards to how the system is going to affect the action that you choose. Did that help that make sense? Is that? Yeah. How can I help with that? Or maybe with a little more detail I can attach to something and.
I don't know. I'm gonna have to watch lectures for sure.
Okay. Happy to talk to people individually in small groups as you come to common understandings of what people do or don't, or what you want a little bit more attention on. But I'll go into a little bit more detail about it, maybe that helps as well. So we can't figure out the value of a state directly from just the state itself. We have to consider the associated distribution of where you could end up with the associated likelihood that you end up there. So to figure out the value of this state, you have to look at what are all the states we could end up in. What is the value of ending up in that state? And what is the likelihood that I end up in that state? And then you sum the associated utility from those calculations. So this really is just a complicated expected value calculation. It really just looks like an expected value calculation because that's what it is. If you're uncertain to have that associated result, like let's play a game right now where I'll have you roll 2 dice. If you roll a 2, you instantly fail the course. If you roll a 12, you instantly get an A in the course and have to do no further work. And if you roll something in between, it just kind of scales how much work I expect of you. There could be some number of associated outcomes where the probability of rolling that 12 is 1 in 36. And let's assign the value of passing the class as 1,000. It's going to save you so much time and effort and stress that that's a good thing. maybe, it's probably not great, you're here for a reason, but. If, assuming that that has significant value, you would say that 1,000 gets divided by 36, because there's a 1 in 36 of that happening in the first place. So being in this state where you have, with some action, that's one of the places you might end up, that adds 1,000 over 36 value to this state. On the other hand, if you instantly failed the course, let's say that that's negative 1,000. And since there's a 1 in 36 chance of that happening, that would cancel each other out with regards to the utility that it's adding to this state. If there's more good than there is bad, then you're going to end up with a positive value of this state. But the idea is it's weighted by the likelihood of getting to that state, because it's not guaranteed that you end up in that position. Does that make sense? Take you back to 380 or some other stats course you've had in the past? We call this the expect minimax because it's really just taking an expected value over all of the values of all of the possible states. So some lovely utility math for you. So expect minimax just says that if it's the chance node that's acting, we take the expected value of the result. If max is moving, then we take the maximum value of the chance nodes that could come after it. And the same for minimax, for min. Since chance acts in between max and min, if it's max's turn, we're going to say take the maximum of all the chance nodes. If it's the chance nodes, then we're going to figure out the value of being in that chance node is going to be the expected value of everywhere you could end up from that chance node. Does that make sense? Maybe. Blank stares. Excellent. I saw 2 nods and everything else was blank. Data. I have none. So in real applications, this tree is going to be large enough that you can't parse the entire thing to make a truly informed decision. So you're still going to need an approximation or a heuristic or something that helps you to be able to make decisions. You can use Monte Carlo search on expect minimax, just like you can on minimax. So you can start to gather data, even if you don't have approximations for what the chance is. You can learn the values of these chance nodes through experience. You can also cut off the search depth, apply an evaluation function at that point to say, well, look ahead 4 moves or 5 moves, and then we can make an intelligent decision based on that. So everything we've already described with regards to how we would handle a typical adversarial search, we can do in a stochastic environment as well. It just adds the complexity of taking an expected value at every chance node. So yes, we must incorporate chance node weights into the evaluation function, which makes move ordering really challenging. Because that makes it really hard to figure out if we can prune nodes or which node to identify and parse in which order, because each one of those isn't just a value that you can try to look up and sort on, but it's going to involve querying all of the chance nodes for each one of those. And oftentimes that level of work is more expensive than just using arbitrary move ordering. So that is one big challenge with this move between them. So here's an example. It's worth thinking that there's not necessarily a best move in a given turn, but there's a best move per chance outcome per turn. So that allows you to, again, backtrack via the expected value and make an informed decision, but it may not work out based on your analysis. You may end up in a worse situation than was expected. And especially if you don't already have a way of measuring that, if you're gathering data, it may make you think that the value of this state is actually lower than it is. We can also talk about this when we get into reinforcement learning, But trying to figure out, based on the information that you're gathering, which nodes are better or worse. Sometimes you're just really unlucky. And in what would be a good state, you keep having unlucky results from that, and that leads you to undervalue being in that state, which may make you decide to not go down that path based on just a small sample of unlucky events. So how could we algorithmically devise some way to intelligently make decisions when we know that we might be getting especially lucky or especially unlucky? The especially lucky solves itself because we will continue to want to do that, and the law of large numbers will kick in and it will approximate the expected value. But if we get unlucky, it may always look like there's a better move to try, but there's low sample on this. So scaling the runtime, if you're going to analyze for every single chance outcome, now that we're incorporating that into the move ordering algorithm, that just becomes an extra scalar on the runtime. Yeah, so if the average chance branching factor is 2 or 3 or 4, your algorithm will run 2 or 3 or 4 times slower. Which is just the unfortunate reality of being in a stochastic world. Or you decide it's not worth trying to calculate for move ordering. How do you prune in stochastic environments? We'll talk about actually figuring that out as well. So chance nodes can be pruned as well to say that it's not worth exploring the entire subtree under this chance node. It doesn't seem to have a large enough effect on the calculation for this node, so why bother considering it? It's not worth diving in and looking at this entire subtree. If the chance of going down this node is super small, then it's not going to matter too much what the utility of that subtree is. It's not going to affect the overall expected value by much. So I actually already talked about this a little bit, but if you calculate the weighted average for something, it may become impossible to think about the unconsidered moves, which make it, how do I want to state this? Oftentimes I have this idea in my head and it doesn't come together in a verbose way, a nice way to state it. How do I want to get this idea across? I think even the idea of something like the lottery example is a good example, where once you've won, now you actually care to explore it, but until you've won the lottery, it looks like a terrible move. And the chance node may actually, when it's weighted into the average, it pushes it into a place where now that it was 0.00000 something positive, now it pushes you into a place where you would consider playing that lottery if the expected value were positive. But because it is so unlikely to win, that would be bad. Like imagine that there's a lottery that you have a 1 in a million chance of winning. It costs you $1, but when you win, you get $2 million. The expected value is positive. You actually want to play that game, assuming that you have no risk aversion. But in order for the experience to map to that expected value, it's going to take you longer and longer to get to that point where it is positive, and it helps you to consider that maybe we should actually play this lottery. Yeah.
They say something, so in psychology, they say to imagine the worst case least likely scenario and the best case least likely scenario.
Yeah.
And that way you can better plan the middle, so you get a better lay of the
Yeah, you can at least see the bounds of the problem. But sometimes if the best case and the worst case are very unlikely, then it really just depends on the entirety of the distribution. So we can use forward pruning, which we talked about before. So as an example of something like rolling 5 dice in Yahtzee, that's a very high branching factor. So that's spread across every possible outcome to rolling 5 dice. That's going to be incredibly expensive to try to figure out The associated move ordering, if for every single move, you have to consider every possible outcome of rolling 5 dice. There are a lot of possible results of that, and trying to analyze and back propagate that into the decisions that you're going to make at that node adds a lot of complexity to the problem. Yeah,
Just to make sure I've got it right in my head, the chance nodes, like that branching factor for them is how many different possibilities come out because of that random chance.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah, so for 5 dice, you would have 5 as the first possibility. You'd roll a 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, and then up to a 6, 6, 6, 6, 6. So everything between 5 and 30 are the possible rolls for that. So you'd have a 5 with the weight of how likely a 5 is from 5 dice, a 6 for how likely a 6 is, a 7, all the way up to a 30. And all of that would be needed to consider when thinking about the expected value of being in this state and rolling the 5 dice. Then there'd be an associated value of being, all right, assuming that I got a 17 on that, what is the value of what I can do with that particular distribution of those dice? What's the value of that state? It's gonna be a low probability, but it's gonna have a drastically different value from some potential other rolls. Yeah,
So is this the idea that like you would prune values that are least likely to occur? So like if you have like a distribution, like a normal bell curve, you would just cut off like the ends of the bell curve and just ignore those?
Yeah.
Okay.
Something like that, where you look at the most likely outcomes. Of course, in something, there's a little bit more that's needed there, because in the lottery example, even though it's a very unlikely outcome, the utility is so high that it affects the entirety of the distribution. So you'd be looking for, are there outcomes that, in addition to being unlikely, just don't add anything to the utility? If so, don't go down that path and figure out, all right, if I roll a 5 with 5 dice, and then my opponent does this, and then I do that, you're exploring an entire subtree that is so incredibly unlikely and so expensive to calculate because of that relative unlikely event, unless it drastically changes the game. It's not worth considering. Now we get to the real cyber fun, because this is the realm of the entirety of the cyber game, which is partial observability. I think I'm getting this right. Partial observability is when you don't have full information of what the world's state is. So you have to use the information that you have combined with the belief states that we were talking about in local search to try to figure out some information about the state so that you can make an informed decision based on all possible states you could be in based on the information that you have. So to do this, I'm going to introduce you to one of my favorite games, and if we had more time, I would want people to actually play this because it is so incredibly fun. Kriegspiel is a variant of chess where you see the board from your perspective, and everything the opponent is and has is hidden from you. You do not know where any of their pieces are.
I figured it out. You can skip these slides.
So you do need a referee, because there are going to be potentially completely illegal moves. Like I move my king into check. That is not legal in chess. So you use that information as well of what is legal and not legal. You can make a move or suggest a move to the referee, thinking that this is a good move. If it's not, it's going to give me a lot of information about the state of the board. So referee who can see all pieces, but I like to think of this as you have a board, they have a board, and the referee has a board. And you see your pieces, they see their pieces, the referee sees every single piece, but no one can see each other's boards.
So just, so I understand, but the part of like the observable part of this is like being able to utilize the referee to like get an idea of the space.
You know where your pieces are, which reduces the domain to the knowledge of, here's the information that I have. But what you know about where your opponent's pieces are is based on a history of what you have tried to do and what the referee has said.
Okay.
So it's very hidden behind a file.
But if this is like a weird set of chess, when any interaction from
my piece to your piece, wouldn't that just take out the piece? Then, and then I would have no idea unless like there was some sort of.
You would, yeah, the referee will say, capture on this space. And depending on the variant of Kriegspiel, you can either say capture by a particular piece. Or capture of a particular piece that becomes common knowledge. But you do know when you successfully captured something.
You almost wanna set up traps rather than attack.
Yeah, that's a significant portion of Kriegspiel. Is if you can send messages to the other player that says, hey, capture this piece, set them up for that, then you can capture what they had, and which maybe is a trap from their perspective. So you get a trap dimensionality.
You already get international.
So player whose turn it is proposes a move to the referee. The referee either accepts that move or rejects it with some information. So if it's illegal, so I try to move a pawn into a space that is occupied by another piece. Can't do that. So then the referee just announces illegal in a way that both players can hear and understand. They don't say where that happened. That's only information for the player whose turn it is. They don't say what piece created that or what you were bumping into. All you get is illegal. So you know, as the moving player, there was a piece at that location. And from the player whose turn it is not, you get a sense of what information is the opposing player trying to get. Are they bumping pawns up against a bunch of things? In which case that might give you a little bit of information about where their pawns are because they're trying to push something forward and continually running into a block.
So going back to my piece, taking your piece,
Yeah,
would the ref tell me if I took a piece of yours, like your piece, or would?
yes, you would get there would be a global announcement of capture on this square.
Okay.
And then the referee would tell the player whose turn it is not which piece to remove.
So it's like a two-way uncertainty.
Yeah.
Okay.
Loops, the referee will continue to say illegal, illegal, illegal until a move is accepted, in which case then it becomes the other player's turn. So you do not give up your turn if you come up with an illegal play.
So, sorry again,
No,
like you had to do probing then with like rooks. or
Yeah.
Bishops.
yes. But as soon as your probe leads to an accepted move, if your probe leads to a very bad position for you, so you have to trade off, if this move is accepted, what does that tell me? How much danger does it put that piece in?
This would be pre-processing.
Yes. And then you would figure out from there, what move do you actually want to assert based on the amount of information it will get you and the result of the associated move, given the information that you have collected already. So I just want people to think for a little bit about how you would play this game intelligently, because to me, this is the kind of game that best represents the cyber world. Feel free to agree or disagree with that and or come up with some kind of alternate reasoning for that, because I would love to hear that. But in creating this without that level of background, this to me felt like the best that we could do. With regards to, you know what the opposing player is capable of, but you don't know where they are. You don't know what pieces are in place and ready to affect you in ways that you know what can happen when it happens, but you don't know when it's going to happen or what strategy is behind it when it does.
So,
Yeah,
Only other thing I can say is you also don't know where half of your pieces are either, because nobody's documented.
right, yeah, if you're working for a company that is not prepared or a system that is not prepared for that, yeah, there can be further fog of war. And that makes it even harder. And imagine playing Kriegspiel where, all right, you don't know where your pawns are. You can suggest to move a pawn forward, or even you suggest to move a pawn forward and you don't know whether it moves forward or not. You don't know the location of your pawn at that point because you didn't get feedback about whether your move was successful or not.
the goal is saying, the capture, sorry.
Yeah, you have to checkmate the king.
Okay.
It's not capture the king, it is checkmate the king.
Well, so like, as far as like playing Kriegspiel, like intelligently, like. You already would probably want to avoid using like. common strategies from chess because they're predictable.
Right,
It sets
there's
you
a whole
up,
predictability,
and instead of like being worried about placing your pieces to like protect and guide and like route other pieces, you're looking more at probing at that point in time because you
information.
need to figure out what's going on.
Yeah,
So you would wanna avoid doing like probably very obvious moves because like, you know, like, cause what, there's like an opening move where you can just like push your rook like butt head right.
right,
So if on like turn two, the opponent tries to move one of their pawns forward and it says illegal because there's a piece there and it's like, oh, okay, well, I know what they opened with,
right.
and that makes you vulnerable
Right.
right off the bat, so.
Yeah, thinking about ambiguity, how can you create ambiguity from your opponent's perspective when they try to probe at your defenses or how you're starting to push your pieces forward? It creates an entire back and forth there that is really interesting to consider. Yeah,
I agree somewhat that intelligently you'd wanna skip normal openings. But I feel like you'd wanna skip normal white openings, which are generally offensive in nature, right? And you'd like go with a normal black opening that's defensive, cause that like at least could give you possibly a better position, right?
yeah,
Like, you still wanna gather information through probing, but as soon as a probe goes through, like your first like 2-3 moves. You're pretty much guaranteed for it to work, cause the chessboard's set up the same, right?
yeah, it's hard to push very quickly into opponent territory, kind of knight, and start messing around with
Yeah,
the
you
knights.
literally
But
have to
on
jump
turn
on knight.
3,
Yeah.
you see capture on, and there's a piece there already. How did that happen? Either a pawn opened and a bishop got out, or a knight got out, or a queen got out, or you can start to get information about, can they possibly reasonably be protected at this point if there's a capture on that square?
Yeah. So, I was just gonna say, so I feel like to play it intelligently, it's gotta be like pure defense.
Yeah.
Like, you can, if you take the offense, it's a huge gamble.
Yeah. But from the opponent's perspective, if you take that risk, do they think that it's protected? If you set up the ambiguity from their perspective, they may hesitate and think that you're setting up a trap.
Cause if you stretch yourself, you're both like. Giving your, like, you're opening yourself up, but also like potentially saying, like, I've set something up, do you really wanna take this piece or these pieces that you groped and found?
Yeah.
You're also confusing your opponent. If you set it out randomly, where your opponent's trying to follow some actual, move set. They encounter you, they'll think you're following a move set also, and then think you're on a different path, that'll put them down on the best likely scenarios and.
Yeah, it kind of becomes that program that always went all in. As soon as you anticipate that your opponent is doing something intelligent, sometimes the right counterplay is to act randomly.
Say there's a couple ways you could do being, I don't know, aggressively defensive, where one player has like a defense set up where they have like a pros. Basically,
Yeah.
and it's just a waiting game from there.
Mm-hmm.
But then the attacker could do a false flag attack to make it seem like they're shifting their attack there, but in reality, they're shifting their defense.
Yeah. I just love this game for how it's related to game theory, how it's related to just adversarial search in general, because partially observable games are so real life and they're really hard to emulate in an academic environment. But if you can emulate them in some capacity, you really start to train your brain to think in the ways of reality. Because if this game seems hard, it is, but that's also reality. Reality is usually this difficult. So if you can optimize a constrained system like this, then you can start to think about how to optimize a system that is just as complicated. So what's done is you keep track of a belief state. I already talked about this, but you think about all logically possible void states given the information that you receive or that you have throughout the history of the game. Every single time you try to make a move and it's either legal or illegal, it's going to give you some information about the state of the game. It starts out with there are tons of pieces on the board and a few moves in, almost any of them could be at any particular spot, given the history of how many moves have happened in the game. Very little is pinned to its opening state 5 moves into the game. You could have arranged a set of moves that move that piece. So everything you do at that point, when you receive capture notifications and see that some pieces are coming off the board, it reduces the possible state space from any piece could be anywhere. And the goal is to minimize that belief state, to be able to say, now I know we're in one of 80 possible states. With this move, I can shrink that down. Sometimes sacrificing pieces to gain knowledge is worthwhile, even if there's no counterplay. If it minimizes the belief state, because soon you get a sense of exactly what's going on. And a lot of closing moves in Kriegspiel are that you know exactly the state of the game. You've pinned it to a single state, and now you can use a typical closing checkmate idea to go pin the king somewhere. But it relies on minimizing that belief state in some capacity. So the moves that you make will trade off the associated board position that you're trying to gain with moves that get you information and reduce the size of that belief state. So that when you do make future moves, your future moves are going to be better in nature because you have more information. Even if it seems like a poor play right now, if that gets you enough information to make intelligent moves later, you can more than recoup the immediate loss, which is very different from how typical chess is played. Because with full information, you know exactly what trade-offs you're making. Even if you're looking ahead 3, 4, 5 moves, you can get a sense of, all right, this leads to that, leads to that, leads to that, that's worthwhile for me. But in Kriegspiel, you don't know that. So sacrificing a knight to gain significant amounts of information with no capture on the other side may be a net positive, which is really strange to think about from a chess player's perspective. So instead of there being a chance node here, it's actually your opponent that plays the role of the chance node, because you don't know exactly what they're going to do. And the more information you have, the better approximation you can have for what the values of what your opponent's going to do are. If you know exactly where their pieces are, because you've narrowed the belief state down to exactly one possible board state, then you can, with a much better idea, know what they're more likely to do, because you can evaluate from their perspective how good is each particular move that they could make. So by the time you get to that point, that's a significant advantage. Even if they have more pieces left than you with more power than you, if you know exactly what their board state is, you probably have the advantage. If they don't know what your board state is. Which is also interesting, adds another dimension to the whole consideration of how do I plan this from the beginning? So the search space is way too large if we consider every possible opponent move, because we don't know exactly where their pieces are. If their pieces could be anywhere, any piece anywhere making any move that it's allowed to is a way too large of a search space. But we can get moves for each possible percept sequence. If I try to move this pawn forward and I get an illegal when I do it, and so you generate a sequence of moves that you want to make to get information. And based on that, you can order those moves to try to figure out how much information can I get before I'm likely to make a legal move from that. So you can think about every possible percept sequence that you could get as a response to each move ordering that you try, and that reduces the search space significantly. Allows for you to consider a lot more moves and move options with less computational resource. An actual winning strategy in this game, leading to actual checkmate for every possible board state in the current belief state, is the goal. The goal is not necessarily just to checkmate the king. You can reach that goal by saying that according to every possible state within my belief state, I have a position that can lead to checkmate. You've basically won the game if you can reach that point.
Are you good at this game?
I am garbage at this game. Everyone I've ever met is garbage at this game, but it's a fun algorithmic, because computers are actually quite good at it.
So if you like checkmate, or you put a king in check, right?
Yeah.
But they could take your piece, but they don't know what piece it is. Do they go illegal until they take your piece? Is that how that works?
Until you either have some move that puts a piece into an empty square or a piece that captures.
Okay, so like, yeah, so say I like rush with my knight
Yeah.
and they move some other piece and it's
Yeah.
acceptable. But they can't though, right? Cause it would be illegal if it leaves their king in check and they could make a move to take
Right,
it out.
so that's gonna be something, so the referee will say check, the referee will say checkmate. So if a piece is in check, now that's actually a great opportunity for the opponent to get a lot of information. What piece is checking my king? If it's a queen along this diagonal and I try a bunch of moves over here, and I get illegal, 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 I can sense the direction that that attack is coming from.
Okay, so you would just get illegal states until you take the piece and
Right.
mock it.
Yes,
It's
which allows you to move forward, or you can try to figure out where is the piece. Maybe they don't know that there's a bishop that could take the queen from the other side. Is that likely, given that? You will have to play around with that, because you could think, all right, now that I've identified the attack is coming from this side, I can now start to move my pieces and try to capture the piece that is checking this king based on your defensive setup. And maybe that leads to the fact that you got a check at that point leads you to play around with and get a bunch of information that leads for you to take the piece that checked you.
At first I thought I would be good at this game, now I don't think so.
It's really hard.
I mean, it just seems like if you're put in a tricky situation like that, it's almost like in your benefit, like, so if you have a belief state that says like, well, I'm in check and I believe, you know, that like, maybe I have 3 situations I think I might find myself in, that either I'm in check because of a knight, or I'm in check because of a bishop, or I'm in check because of like a rook, then you can start trying to make like purposely bad moves that would put you back in check to explore that belief state.
Correct.
And then once you have that belief state down more, that reduces your belief states to like a specific thing, so you have a better idea of like what your situation is, so you can make a more informed decision.
Yeah,
Yes.
if you're in check and it ends up being by a knight, you could either try to move your king out of the way, or you could take every piece that you have and try to move it toward where the knights could be attacking that from, and end up capturing the piece that's checking.
So instead of exams or a final, can we just like combine that all into, we just 1v1 you in this game and if we win, we can pass? Please.
I would think that the more computer science cyber approach would be to design an intelligent algorithm that plays this and doesn't have security vulnerabilities inside of it, but
That's not as fun, yeah.
no. I think we have more to do, and if we really try to hone in on this exact game, that we'd be losing out on quite a bit. But this is a really fun project.
Kriegspiel, it's Kriegspiel of Go.
Yeah. Go Spiel, go play.
So to kind of go back to the whole concept of sacrificing one particular piece for something else.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of different ways a defender can actually do that.
Yeah.
So if, for example, I worked on a ransomware case years ago, they got into the domain controller. The only option to stop the additional spread was to kill the domain controller, which put them out of commission for a long time.
Right,
They were still doing cleanup 6 months later. But it was worth it to sacrifice that such that the rest of their servers would get nuked as well.
right.
Although that didn't work because we were just a step too late.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, because there's a real time component to it as well. If you delay the decision to make the action, then the expected value of that action is going down with time, so you have reason to spend the time to identify the threat. But you need to do that quickly and efficiently, because the decision, the best decision that you can make is gonna have lower and lower expected value the longer that process takes. So you're trading off lots of variables as you do that, between how long am I taking to identify the threat? How long is it taking for me to make an informed decision? Does the information that I gain from that more than offset the time that it's taking me to make that decision, the extra information that I get? So I think,
Especially because the opponent usually has days to investigate their network.
to prepare, yeah,
Because they are so many steps ahead of you, because up to this point, you haven't been able to see that they're in the network in the first place.
Right.
So like he keeps saying, we can't see the opponent's pieces at all. We know that they exist somewhere in the world. We just don't know that they're right here in front of us.
It's
Yeah.
kind of the concept of a hunting net, it's put out a whole bunch of stuff out there to identify who they are.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of bigger companies will do that. It's just a thing with smaller companies you know, we're talking like Spokane level companies, they don't have the resources to do that.
No,
You can do anything. You can do fun stuff.
Right. They don't have the technical resources to do that. They don't have people who are, you know, up to date on these rather kind of new concepts to them.
you just hope that when the attacker reveals itself, that it's more like a check than a checkmate. Because sometimes they reveal themselves and it's already too late. It's already a checkmate situation.
Yeah.
I think it's insufficient. We should do randomized star states too.
Yeah, that's especially fun too, right? So you start with just your king and I start with the whole board.
There's a really low probability. That was nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll finish this slide and then we can take a quick break, because at this point, it would not help the opponent at all to be able to see all the pieces. So even by the time you reach a state where, regardless of the belief state, you can not be able to see their pieces, they can see your pieces, but you've already created an impossible trap for them. So the information hiding doesn't matter at that point because you pigeonholed them into defeat. So I think that also has some relevance as why that is the goal state. It's also the goal state on attack. If you're going to try to get into someone's network, you want to have set up the checkmate before you do anything. Or at least maximize your chances of, based on whatever it is that you do, you're still going to be in a state to checkmate them based on how they respond to you revealing yourself. But intriguing. Let's take a few minutes and we'll come back to more. I'll leave this up there if anyone wants to think about a limited Kriegspiel during your break. We'll talk about how to apply AI to this to intelligently play. All right, here was an example. But we're gonna move on to thinking about how do we actually intelligently play Kriegspiel? How would we actually utilize AI to figure out which moves to make at an individual level? So you can utilize some of what we've already talked about and or trees, as well as the belief state space, and that can help you to find a guaranteed checkmate if one exists. If you use the incremental belief state, which we talked about with regards to manipulating and finding the move that reduces the belief state space the most, that can find mid-game moves and mid-game checkmates up to about depth 9, which is pretty impressive. You can utilize a piece of data called a probabilistic checkmate, which will, via some training, inform you on how likely a checkmate is going to be based on how random the opponent's moves have been. So you can start to utilize that information and based on that, get a sense of how likely are you, or how much information is unique to them by how random their moves seem to be from your perspective. So all you need to do to isolate if all that's left is a king on the opponent's side, and all you have left is your king. Obviously, the game is stalemated at this point. There's no way to do it, but you can systematically, given an infinite amount of time, locate their king with just your king. So this leads to a bunch of potentially really interesting closing states, closing processes where you're trying to, if you know what pieces they have left, which you should, and you know which pieces you have left, you can systematically protect your pieces and get the information that you need to be able to create an endgame and map it onto an endgame in chess. So if you have king, bishop, knight, and they have king, that is a guaranteed win. You can protect both the bishop and the knight in such a way that you can still identify where their king is and then checkmate their king at the end of Kriegspiel. So these pieces all protect each other, making any capture of these pieces illegal. If the king is what's left and they try to capture your knight, if it's protected by your bishop or your king, then they can't make that capture. And by attempting that capture, they reveal where they are, at least to some extent, which helps you narrow down how much time it's going to take to checkmate them. So if you find yourself in this particular endgame, guaranteed win. As long as you play intelligently and perfectly. So your opponent eventually will reveal their position by some chance. They'll try to move, and that move will be illegal, and that gives you enough information to locate where it is. From there, what you will do is make moves that force them to make a move where you know which move that they made, because any other move would have been illegal because you know where their king is. So you set it up to where they have one legal move, one legal move, one legal move, one legal move. All right, now I navigate you into the trap that is the checkmate. If you have a king and two bishops, and they have a king, there's an out for them, which is interesting to consider because in chess, we like to think of bishops as having about the same value as knights, but in this particular endgame, especially in Kriegspiel, having a knight and a bishop is way better than having two knights. You can only force a checkmate if you leave a bishop unprotected for a single move. And if their king is in a position to take that one unprotected bishop, at that point, they've forced a stalemate. Sometimes there's the information there for them, sometimes they would just luck into it, but regardless, the probability is less than 1 that you win from that endgame state. General strategy for the game, you'll just make informed risks. Moves that create a checkmate scenario in some proportion of the belief states. If you attempt that checkmate and don't get that checkmate, you can eliminate all of the moves that would have checkmated from your belief state. Sometimes that will give your opponent information in terms of a check, and sometimes you don't get anything, in which case the king wasn't where you thought it was in those belief states, which is more information for you. So significant trade-off to everything that you might choose to do. Follow up to help you make decisions on this. How likely will the move lead to checkmate? If it's only in one belief state, one state in a belief state of 100 possible belief states, that's not a ton of information. If it's 98 of them, then either you checkmate or you reduce your belief state space from 100 possibilities to 2. Regardless, that's a move worth making, even if it guaranteed loses you a piece most of the time, because that is a significant amount of information that you will gain from that move. How likely is each board state in the current belief state? So just because there are 100 possible board states doesn't mean that those board states are equally likely. So if you have some way to probabilistically determine how likely each of those belief states are, either based on a history of your opponent's moves, it's not impossible for them to have manipulated the board into this state, but it seems highly unlikely. There's only one set of moves that they could have made, whereas for this other board state, there are 16,000 possible combinations of moves that they could have made that would have led to this board state. You might be able to distinguish the relative likelihoods of different board states. Of course, if you make that assumption, then if the opponent is capable of knowing that intuition, maybe they make the one move ahead so that the one move instead of the 16,000 permutation moves, so that they bait you into doing something because it's more likely that they did that. So a lot of this has counterplay. So there's a very nice strategic back and forth that I have a hard time replicating in just about any other game that's out there. So you can't assume the players make moves randomly. And you can't assume the players act optimally, because if the players act optimally, that's information, and it's so much information that you can exploit it. If you try to play Kriegspiel with Stockfish, that's going to go very poorly. Or assuming that your opponent is using Stockfish, and that way you use Stockfish based on the moves that they would have made if they were using Stockfish, that won't go so well for you, because your opponent can now know that you're doing that and work around it. They use their own Stockfish to figure out what move you're going to make, and then make a move that baits you into something that Stockfish doesn't know, because Stockfish thinks that it's playing optimally, or that you're playing optimally when you're not. So perfect information and perfect play is bad in this situation. So you want something in between random and perfect play, where the value of the moves that you make is positive, but doesn't give away information. And that, to me, more closely represents the kind of play and counterplay that we see in cyber. So, yes, many cyber applications, lots of game theory application as well. We can design an equilibrium solution that says that regardless of my knowing what you're going to do, I can create from your perspective what I think you should do, which informs what I should do, which informs what you should do, which informs what I should do, which leads to some kind of equilibrium. Because your opponent is also thinking along those exact same lines. So you can create a set of moves that are likely, given that I know what you're going to do, knows what I'm going to do, and if either one of you deviates from that, it's bad for them. So that leads to some kind of equilibrium state. That kind of analysis is done in game theory. So if you have the opportunity to take any game theory related course, do it. I plan to teach something along those lines. I think Stu and I agreed that we're gonna pair adversarial, a class that focuses only on adversarial learning with some kind of game theory application. So that's coming at some point in the future. And of course, these computations are too expensive for modern application in Kriegspiel for a lot of that game theory work, but it certainly has applications in smaller domains for smaller problems. Any takeaways, any last discussion items or thoughts on adversarial search? The last slide, the last piece of information before we dive into constraint solving. Have I fried people yet? Are we still awake, alert, have enough caffeine in us?
I was up until 1 AM, sorry.
Gross.
Same.
No caffeine in me, Chris. Half life doesn't last that long, and it would wreck my sleep at this point.
That's fair. I had coffee right before class.
I'm at the same.
I don't get that luxury.
So fair.
My sleep is wrecked by caffeine, by caffeine, by.
It's nice.
I got an almost
Nice.
perfect sleep score and I caffeinated this morning and you still lost me.
A wife that we're in a king size bed, but for some reason she needs like 90% of the king size bed despite being shorter than me. Sick.
You gotta make a secret room in the walls with a bed.
And my cats take up like the other 8%. I find myself scrunched in a corner of a king size bed. How did this happen?
How many cats, man?
2 cats.
Okay, so that's a reasonable number. When you said my cats take up 8%, I was like, that's a lot.
They spread eagle, like,
Okay,
and then they want your body heat, so wife on one side, cats on the other. It's the trash compactor from Star Wars.
Heated blankets.
Dude, cats totally do that. They'll like, you move a little bit and then they'll take up that spot. So every time you move, they sort of just push you off.
Right?
That or they get offended and then leave, and then you feel like you've insulted their mother.
Right?
their
Like,
mother,
how
or-
dare you kick me off this, how dare you interrupt my sleep, says the cat. It's like, what are you doing tomorrow? What do you need to be awake for?
I just wanna say, I love how complicated you made this all sound when it was just a joke from The Princess Bride. I knew you were gonna do that, so I planned to do this. Well, I knew you were gonna plan to do this.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a joke that children get. You can make it so complicated by explaining it.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in an environment where you can't escape from that by just, I poisoned both and took the antidote in advance.
Chris, you should, there's an option for that. You should just do, size bed.
That is a good idea.
Yeah.
All right, constraint satisfaction, constraint solving, you could really call it either one, but constraints are out there in every real world problem that we solve, so we've talked about search, but search with constraints actually reduces the state space of the search in some capacity, but it also allows you to speed up that search in other ways. So goals may be certain combinations of variables or variable value pairs that meet certain criteria, as opposed to just having some state you label the goal. The goal could be I don't know, a way of coloring this particular graph such that no adjacent node is the same color. Many solutions to it, but finding one in some kind of reasonable way is still a process that you will need to go through. It's a subset of color this graph. Only some of them are actual solutions to the problem. If you have a certain amount of computational resource, you divide that computational resource amongst the associated demands on that resource. You can query that or use that in terms of the associated constraints. Some of those will solve the problem, some of them will not. So how do you find a solution in an environment where that search is constrained by one or more variables? General heuristics rather than domain-specific ones, super useful here. So any heuristic that allows you to just eliminate large portions of the state space, you can find variable value combinations that violate the constraints, and that allows you to trim or cut off the search at that point. You can intelligently say that if I put this next to that, then nothing else works. Then that entire branch of that search space is just gone. So there's a lot of optimization that can be done at the constraint level to help make your search significantly more optimized, finish significantly faster. So constraint solvers, constraint satisfaction problems in general are just, you'll represent it with a set of variables. We will just subscript them x sub 1 through x sub n. A set of domains. What are the legal values for each one of those variables? So x sub 1 can take on a range of values that are represented by the set d sub 1. Then x sub 2 with d sub 2 up to x sub n with d sub n. Then a set of constraints that specify how allowable are certain combinations of these variables and their associated values. Some way of testing against that constraint to say, is this a valid solution to the problem, yes or no? And or how close to a solution is this by some metric of distance to a possible solution. So some domains are really simple, discrete, binary even, true, false, continuous, like the entire range of real numbers between 0 and 1. There could be an infinite number of possible values within a particular domain, which means that we cannot exhaustively test every single one because we can't even iterate the reals between 0 and 1. There's no way to even do that. Has anyone seen Cantor's diagonalization and know that's the proof of why that's impossible? The way that I like to intuitively think of it is, what is a reasonable metric? We can't get the smallest real between 0 and 1, I mean 0, but what is the next smallest one past that? What's the successor of a real number that is the closest real number to 0? That process, even by itself, never finishes. 0.000000, there are always more zeros you can add. That process never finishes. As soon as you finish that process, a fork of that process could have added an extra 0, and you have a smaller number. You could think, all right, well, I'll list all numbers in terms of, all right, what are all of the decimals of length 1? You have 0, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, all the way up to 0.9. Then I'm going to list all of the ones with length 2. 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, all length 3, all length 4, all length 5, and you never get to any repeating decimal. You'll never generate that with that process. So if you're interested in the proof of why that is, just look up Cantor's diagonalization. It'll go through the exact process. It's cool, it's worth knowing. But it just means for a test like this that we can't iterate and enumerate every possible value of these sets of variables. So we need some way of dealing with that. In terms of the constraints themselves, we're going to model them as a pair. There is the scope of the constraint, and then a relation between the variables that are constrained. So scope is a tuple. What are the relevant variables? Relation is the allowable values on those variables. As an example, let's say that both x1 and x2 have the domain 1, 2, 3, and some constraint says that x1 must be strictly greater than x2. You can see how there is a search space for this problem, and how the constraint reduces that search space. The problem without the constraint says that we can pair x1 and x2. We can have 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 3, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 1, 3, 2, 3, 3. So the constraint says now we're going to reduce that search space down into just now we have 2, 1, 3, 1, and 3, 2. That's it. We took 6 numbers and we reduced them. 6 possibilities, reduced it down to 3 that adhere to the associated constraint. So we would model it and we would write it as the constraint is between this tuple of variables, this list of variables. We're gonna have x1, x2, that's the scope. The constraint only cares about those 2 variables. And then the domain, the relation there shows that, all right, these are the set of possible values of x1 and x2 that adhere to that constraint. It's probably easier to list it in terms of an actual function instead of the list of all possible states where x1 is greater than x2. So you can list the constraint as a function, and that allows it to represent real values with an infinite search space. Or if it's still discrete, but the size of that discrete set is going to be so large that you really don't want to list it all out. My favorite thing to tell programming 1 students is on the first week, something like, I could make your assignment for the rest of the quarter be to do a bunch of addition and multiplication problems, and then tell you that a computer could have done that in under a second. What's wrong with you? What are you doing here? Which is a fun thing to tell them, but also to realize the power of a computer, and also repetitive work is something that can be automated. But it's something very similar to this. If you find yourself spending a bunch of time figuring out what the actual values of your constraints are, just put it in function form and save yourself a bunch of time. So an assignment to a constraint satisfaction problem is going to be an assignment to every variable. Every variable gets some kind of value, and that creates a vertex in this search space. So we assign every variable a value. There's your vertex. That's a state within this problem. Questions on the setup? We'll keep going. So a legal assignment, we're going to further define this concept of an assignment. A legal assignment doesn't violate any of the constraints that are listed in the problem. So there are lots of assignments that are outside of the scope of the constraints. So in the x1, x2 problem on the last slide, 1, 2, x1 is smaller than x2. It's an assignment, but it's not a legal assignment because of the constraints that have been put on the problem. Further definitions, a complete assignment has to give every single variable a value. You might be able to say something like, as long as x1 is 3 and x2 is not 3, we're guaranteed to have solved the problem. But that's not a complete assignment because we haven't given a value to x2. We gave a range for x2. A solution is an assignment that is both consistent and complete. A partial assignment will leave some variables unassigned. A partial solution is just a consistent partial assignment. So now we're using definitions in definitions, and it's great. We love that in here. So I'm going to state one thing, and that one thing is going to make half of you want to just get up and leave the room for the rest of this lecture. Solving CSPs is NP complete. And to some, that might say, why bother? Why care about them at all if solving them is going to be intractable? Any thoughts on that? Why would we care to study this if an actual solution to this is never possible in a scalable, reasonable amount of time?
I've heard about this before.
The concept of NP complete, or
Just like exploring every possible solution, even though there might not.
yeah.
Felt the front should be along the way.
Whenever we see an intractable problem, what that usually means is the best we're going to be able to do is to apply a heuristic to it. We're not gonna get back an optimal solution to the problem, but we can get back a good solution to the problem. Or we can get back a solution that reduces the search space in some capacity, something that gives us more information. But to get a full solution to any constraint problem, especially as it scales in size, we need to apply more and more advanced techniques to be able to say anything intelligent about it. Which makes this suddenly now a very interesting space to explore, because anything that's actually NP complete means that there is a state of the art that can continuously be improved with more and more information. So if you're in cyber, that means that you want to stay up on the state of the art of some kind of problem like this, because it will be the future backdoor that an attacker uses, be that you, the attacker's role, or you in the defense role, protecting against someone who's using something that is state of the art. If you're aware of it, that means you can factor it into the associated update for a defense. Or utilize it to attack a system that does not have an updated state of the art defense. To gain some kind of gain a time advantage. There are subclasses of constraint problems that can be solved efficiently. So also an intelligent, aware person will be able to determine this kind of problem can be solved and this kind of problem cannot. This kind of problem needs a heuristic. This kind of problem can be solved in the brute force. This reminds you a little bit of the first project in this course, when you could determine when can you come up with an exact solution to a graph, when could you come up with the best you could hope to do is to have an approximately reasonably good solution to the problem. How do you determine when that is? You could have phrased this in terms of a constraint problem. Had you known about that at the time. Let's give you an example that we will probably use for way too long, and it'll get a little bit dry in this. But we're going to map Australia's states and territories, and we're going to try to color this graph in a way that no adjacent territory has the same color. I hinted at that as a potential constraint problem earlier, and this is one that I could probably give to a first grader and have them solve with red, green, and blue markers. But looking at this, what's a solution to this? Or how would you go about thinking about a solution to this?
Normal green.
All right, so David needs to be sent back to first grade, because I said a first grader could solve this.
Hey, first grader problems,
You
right
get
up my alley.
South Australia one color, and then you just alternate colors.
Why starting with South
It
Australia?
has the most neighbors.
Yeah, so there is some way to narrow the search space to this. If you give South Australia a color, that means that none of the associated neighbors to that vertex could be that associated color.
Low key, it's really smart. I wouldn't have gotten that.
That's incredibly intelligent. It takes a search space that is very large and it immediately constrains it to something that almost solves itself. Regardless, once you make that decision, this is the one blue location. Then we take green and red, and whatever we do to Western Australia, someone tell me, is Western Australia green or red? It doesn't matter, there's a solution for either. If it's red, then that constrains Northern Territory to be green, which constrains Queensland to be red, which constrains New South Wales to be green, which constrains Victoria to be red, and Tasmania doesn't matter because it's unconnected.
I think Tasmania could be green.
It could be anything. There's no constraint on that. But having an understanding of this graph, and this will help you to understand a lot of the optimizations that we can make to constraint problems and why this was a very intelligent thing to do first. We're going to cover all of that here as we start to dive into this problem in a little bit more detail and figure out how can this apply to larger problems that you can't look at and see a solution to in a reasonable amount of time? Questions on the problem, the setup, a potential solution to it? Do we agree that there are multiple solutions to it? How many solutions are there?
Well, at least three, at least six. Because South Australia could be any one of the three colors. And then
Yeah,
You have one option, depending on what you choose for West Australia. I guess no, more.
Yeah, there are two.
Tasmania can be any color also, so.
correct.
Yeah.
And that creates a branching factor from there. So 3 options here times 2 options for everything else is 6. Times 3, 18 possible solutions to the CSP.
I mean, that's only if you choose the one method of choosing South Australia.
Any other method is still going to identify those 18, but that is the easiest way to phrase that problem. That's the easiest way to come up with the answer. There is no easier way to do that, and there are many harder ways to come up with that conclusion.
Also have to put the starting positions, so you're Tasmania, South Australia.
Yeah. So by taking the most constrained variable and solving that first, that actually reduces the search space for the rest of the tree. So that's cool.
I like that,
Sorry?
I like that.
Yeah. So we can take this image and just turn it into a graph. And any constraint problem can be represented as a graph of some kind like this, which helps us to be able to apply the same techniques to different problems. You don't need to be able to visualize it like this. You can visualize it like a graph. And if you do that, your life will be much easier. So step 1, turn the information that you need into an associated graph representation. Step 2, we need to be able to understand what are the constraints. So we're going to model those constraints with language like the last couple of slides so that we can apply an algorithmic process to that idea. And I think having gone through the intuition of applying it to a small problem first will help the algorithmic process make more sense. Try to tie it back to the process that we used to solve this smaller problem. So the constraints, you could measure them as, all right, each pair of variables that are adjacent to each other in this graph cannot have the same color. From there, we can enumerate all of the pairs of colors. And then we want to come up with something that applies pairs of colors to neighbors that don't violate these constraints. Or come up with assignments that don't violate those constraints. So if we set something like South Australia equals blue, then anything that we attempt from here may or may not violate a constraint from that problem. And if we go through that entire search space and we find that there is no solution, then we have to backtrack depth first all the way back to assign South Australia a new color. At least in the naive version of this. So let's give you an example. Once we make a particular move, like assign South Australia blue, we prune the 243 neighboring assignments all the way down to 32. None of its neighbors can be blue. So anything, any of the possible complete assignments that had South Australia as blue and something else that neighbors it as blue, all gone from the search space. So you might think that an intelligent first move would be the one that reduces the search space by the most. And if we could identify that South Australia is that vertex, that by making an assignment to that vertex, we reduce the search space by the most. That's a good first thing to do. It turns out that an old problem, our old friend, the 8 queens problem, can also be formulated as a constraint problem. It makes sense, right? You can't have 2 queens in the same column. You can't have 2 queens in the same row. You can't have 2 queens in the same diagonal. So we could create a constraint problem out of 8 queens. Scheduling problems are also formulated as constraint solving. Whenever we have to figure out as a department who's teaching what when, in which classroom, there are associated constraints on time overlaps. There are constraints on prerequisites. There are constraints on making sure that the same professor isn't teaching two classes at the same time. We're wizards, but we're not wizards to that extent. I think there was one person in Brazil who could use two different voices and say two different words at the same time. That was cool. I do not have that ability. But scheduling is a constraint problem as well.
There was that one guy that was working jobs at the same time in tech.
Yeah,
So.
yeah,
They found it on fire.
yeah. Yeah, that was fun.
Roommate's cousin had 12 jobs. He got fired like 2 months ago.
So what kinds of constraints can we break down constraints into further classes that we can analyze? The first one would be unary. It's a constraint that operates on only a single variable. So something like we can make a constraint that operates on South Australia, and the constraint would be now that South Australia cannot be green. That is a unary constraint because it only affects one variable, South Australia. There are binary constraints that operate on two variables. So something like South Australia cannot be the same color as, and I already regret not memorizing what that was, New South Wales. There are higher order constraints that operate on more than two variables. So you might see something like between y, x, z that says that y is between x and z. Either x is greater than y is greater than z, or z is greater than y is greater than x. So that's constraints on three variables, but you could have higher order constraints on an arbitrary subset of your variables. You can have global constraints. And these will operate on some number of variables that can change depending on which are assigned or which aren't. So something like an all diff says that every variable has to hold a different value. Does this make you think of any possible game that you might play with an all diff? Where would an all diff be useful? Some game that you've probably all played. Yeah, Sudoku is what I'm thinking of.
Oh,
Yeah, I heard it mumbled.
I mumbled, wasn't wrong.
Yeah, a Sudoku has an all diff requirement on rows, columns, and cells. So we need to be able to formalize that kind of constraint. That is a global constraint on the system itself. Let's give you an example. And this will get your brains working right before the end of class. Has anyone seen this problem before? Where each of these letters represents a different digit. And so we want this addition problem, whatever digit represents T, W, and O, we want 2 plus 2 to equal 4. And we need a legal assignment of T, W, O, F, U, and R that allow for this to mathematically be correct.
Be the index of the order now.
So these are all a digit between 0 and 9.
And
that's it.
Is this kind of like, is it kind of like those problems where you could have like, it'll be like barrel square equals, or it'll be like barrel equals 5, it'll be like barrel square barrel equals whatever, is kind of.
Kind of,
The same.
but it's a mathematical addition representation. So we know O
Yeah.
plus O equals R
Yeah,
with some carry. That carry plus W equals U.
yeah, okay.
What if only the T's have carry though? How do we know that the other ones?
Well, the carry might be 0.
Yeah, okay, that's a great point. I didn't think of it that way. I mean, carry.
So this is, I feel like this is worth the time. See if you can find a solution to this.
They've already shouted it out.
No, I already said it.
You already said it?
All zeros.
Yeah.
They have to be distinct. Otherwise, they would all be the same character. There cannot be overlap.
It doesn't say that.
I'm stating that now as an additional constraint. There is an all diff on all of the
No,
variables.
the Australian thing, when I said all green, you didn't put on the thing. The constraint, you just said color in Australia.
A true first grader, he's like, coloring book, I know how to minimize the work that this is, all the same. Man, you must have been a fun elementary school student, David.
No, now that I'm in college, I just won't do the assignment.
Is zero a viable choice?
Yes.
On one,
On one of them, but only one of them. But note that if it's 0 plus 0, you would expect the output here, if 0 were O, this output would also have to be 0, because 0 plus 0 is 0, carries 0. So that actually can't be by the nature of the all-diff constraint. So I did not look up the answer to this when I was making this slide, and I was like, all right, I gotta see how efficient I am at this. And the answer for me was 41 seconds. Not trying to compare to anything else,
Yeah,
but I was
I
was curious to just see if my intuition was good on a problem like this, and it was adequate.
T can be 2 and O can be 4. So that way T matches up to O. And then O doesn't cross the values of O's being
Yeah.
This is the easiest one to find.
0.
it's one,
Has to be 1.
it has to.
So that puts constraints on what T is, because now we need something that carries that 1.
O has to be,
It's 5, right?
O has to be even, it can't be zero, it has to be even, and this.
Yeah, so I think if it were 0, if this were 5, 5 and 5 would be 10, which would force this to be a 0. 0 plus 0 would have to be 0.
But it has to be even because it's the product of two, the addition of two of the same, which means it can't.
Well, maybe unless W plus W has a carry.
Yeah, how did we intuit that F has to be 1?
Because it's not-
Because if it were 0, it wouldn't be there.
You don't get it because.
Has to be a
Yeah,
carry.
it has to be a carry. And if-
Because otherwise it would be the equivalent to F
Because
4.
9 plus 9.
Yeah, couldn't you just
The
do that
maximum
then?
you have is 18.
That would tell you though, right? As soon as there was an F out in front of this, you say this has to be 0.
No, I'm saying that, W can be whatever you want it to be.
No.
As long as it-
There is one solution to this problem.
What?
There's only one solution to this problem. One legal assignment of these letters that make this work out mathematically.
So you got this in 40 seconds?
Yeah, ish.
Alright.
This guy.
Brag, brag.
I was just curious. I was going through this and I wasn't using the constraint. I wasn't using anything from the rest of this chapter. It's like, can I logic this together? And then, because I'm curious, because I want to be able to look at how humans learn and how they apply what they know to reduce state spaces and work on something versus the actual algorithmic, how a computer goes through and narrows that search space. Because we don't have a ton of computational resource up here, but what we do have is incredibly efficient at what it does, parallelization.
So with T
So
be
O is
4, and then W would be 6, and then O would be.
Well, it has to be, if you make T4, O has to be 8.
Yeah. 1, 4, 6, 8, if that was the case.
I have papers.
Right. So you can actually do it as a constraint hypergraph.
That makes it more simple, for sure.
So we know that O plus O creates an output. And then we get a carry. And then, so that carry feeds in with W to the next, which feeds into, so the legal assignments to this are thought of as a graph that can help to narrow that search space, yeah.
So FOUR is 1, 4. 1, 4. 2, 8, where O is 4, W doesn't matter, W can be whatever it wants to be, as long as it's under 5, right? And then T is 7. A 7 would make a 1, 4, and then U and W don't matter, they could be whatever they want. And O just has to be 7, or O has to be 4. Or,
That's a carry.
4, R would be 8. Which is under 10, no carry, U would be under 10, no carry, and T would make 1, 4, for FO.
I'd have to validate that. The solution that I came up with was this. And I thought it was the only solution.
W just has to be under 5, because you don't wanna carry.
Yeah,
That's-
But it could be anything under 5, which means you could be anything.
No, it can't be anything under 5, because if it's 4. Then it comes out to an 8, which would
That's right,
make
it
the
can't
U
be,
and an
yeah,
O.
it can't be. a 4.
yeah,
So yeah, I think Chris is right, there's one solution, because then if it were 3s, then it would be an R. Yeah. It could,
No, because R is 8.
right, that's why I'm saying W can't be 3. Thus meaning it cannot be.
T is not.
But if W was 3, the answer would be 6. Like,
Right, which would be R and not.
R is 8, or,
Right.
okay, but, oh wait, R is 8.
Just
Did I miss this up?
16, you carried 1, 2, then let's say you get 5 out of 2.
I know, it's a tough problem. I actually had a lot of fun with this, and I thought throwing it on this would be good, because it's something that I feel like is solvable if you give people enough time. But it also makes you think in terms of those constraints. But then it also makes you think about the difference between how you solve the problem and how you would program a general solution to a problem like this, because that's going to be different. So I think this is a really good example for that reason.
Sorry, you have one for more than 41 seconds, man, that is unfortunate.
I figured out the
Suffering
F,
from success.
and from the F that put constraints here, I figured out there had to be a carry between here to be able to produce that. So it
Yeah.
constrained this value to be greater than 5, which constrained this to contain a carry, which constrained this to be odd, which constrained this, and it fell into place from there. You just test the possible values that this could produce, then you plug in whatever this could produce to here and see if it solves the rest of the problem. And I think it was the second one that I tried that did. I first tried, I think it was, did I try 7 first here, thinking this could be 4 and 4, but since this had to have a carry, that couldn't work either.
Yeah, okay, I got 714 for TWO, 1428 for FOUR, and I think it works.
Huh,
There you go as well. There are multiple solutions.
according to the internet, I did not actually go validate it.
I
But-
got
Sweet, that's good to know.
The more interesting.
And it also tells me that my intuition for this was wrong.
The more interesting one is in base 7,
Yeah,
so. Okay.
so I think that's cool. I think this is a really cool example for that. Any questions on the problem? What we know now is a solution and not the only solution.
W, so if O is 8, right?
Mhm.
And it would make R 6, so you carry the 1, so if W is 2, so 2, 2, U should be. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that's where, but W can be other numbers too.
Yeah. Because there's no other constraint on U, except that W plus W has to be U, so anything that doesn't create a carry there would work. Yeah. That makes sense. So far, we've discussed searches that we have to have a frontier, things that are adjacent in some capacity to something that we've explored. And then we explore an edge and a vertex that's adjacent to that, and that allows us to continue to explore the space. We explore a new node, we add its neighbors to a frontier with some heuristic, we figure out which node to go visit next, and that expands the frontier and the list of visited nodes that we've seen so far. And that's true for just about any search that we can do, because we have to use a deterministic approach to this. We don't have any non-determinism in our computers, really. So we have to have some process by which to rank potential nodes to explore and an ability to add nodes that can be explored to a frontier. On the other hand, constraint solvers, rather than just exploring a node, have values for which they can set that particular node, which propagate the constraint to its neighbors. So one option for an action is to assign some variable some value. South Australia is blue. That assignment is a partial solution. We can use inference via constraint propagation that says, if we make this choice, then we can reduce the search space to this. We can do that as pre-processing or in parallel with the search, which creates an interesting logistical decision when we look at a search problem. Do we want to try to make the runtime of this as fast as possible by having figured out how all of the constraints propagate? Or do we want to intelligently do less work at runtime because we'll be able to reduce that search space faster at runtime, but we might be spending more time at runtime to do that. So overall less work, but the work is happening at the important runtime time, which especially in cyber, you don't want to be doing anything at runtime. You want to have compiled as much as you can ahead of time so that when you need this algorithm to perform in the moment, I don't care if it's done 5 years worth of work in preparation of today, today is the day for action. When we need you, we really need you. So sometimes the inference solves the entire problem. We kind of saw this in the Australia example. You apply something to South Australia, then apply a color to anything else that's not Tasmania. And the entire problem, there's only one thing to put anywhere except for Tasmania, which can take anything. So it almost solves the entire problem and doesn't create much of a search at all. There's only one valid assignment for certain other variables propagating all the way throughout to create a solution, which is cool. So now we can just treat each variable in our constraint solving problem as a graph node, each binary constraint on the variables as an edge between those, and we create a constraint graph. If you enforce local consistency, that means that the possible neighbors have to adhere to the constraints as part of the problem. Then we're doing pruning as we go. You make a valid assignment at one node, we start pruning neighbors from that, and we now have a limited search that we can make for a solution. Inconsistent values are eliminated as we search. To do this, we need to define a couple of consistency metrics. What is this local consistency and how can we implement it? So the first is called node consistency. So we're just looking at a single variable, a single node and its value. It's consistent if the values in that domain satisfy all of the associated unary constraints in the system. Does that make sense? So something like South Africa can't be blue. If we make the assignment South Africa is blue, we violated the unary constraint that South Australia, some other continent starts with an A, is blue. It can't be blue. That is a unary constraint that gets violated. But node consistency is just making sure that at the node level, we haven't violated any unary constraint. So South Australians refuse to be colored some particular color. Then we can now go through the domain of that variable and eliminate all possible values of possible assignments of that color that violate that constraint. So if we know that South Australia can't be green, then we go through the domain of South Australia and eliminate green as a possible value. So that is going through node consistency. It's just ensuring that each domain at each node adheres to each unary constraint. That make sense? We can call the entire graph node consistent if every variable in that graph is node consistent. So at every node, since each node represents a variable, if any potential assignment for that doesn't violate any unary constraint, then the entire graph is node consistent. What's nice is this entire process is actually really easy. You just loop through all of the nodes in the graph, and you can then eliminate, you can check for each possible assignment, does it violate a unary constraint? If so, eliminate it. If not, leave it as a possibility. So that pre-processing just by itself eliminates a significant portion of the search space if you have a number of unary constraints. What factor are we saving if we say that South Australia can't be green? How many potential solutions, viable or not, legal or not, to the constraints are there? And by saying this can't be green, how many are we eliminating? 1/3 of them, yes. So that's pretty significant. Even with a single unary constraint, we take the possible permutations of this graph and we remove 1/3 of them. If you have larger constraints, n-ary constraints, you can convert them all into binary constraints, which means that what I'm going to talk about next, arc consistency, you actually don't have to go too much past that because we have the ability to now turn everything into these binary constraints. So we only have to worry about unary constraints and binary constraints. So if I say between y, x, z, how can I turn that into a set of constraints over just two variables? Drawing that out, we know we have either x is greater than y is greater than z, or we have z is greater than y is greater than x. Can we turn this into a set of constraints that only operate on two variables?
Y greater than X, Y greater than Z.
So we would have to combine them a little bit. Like we could say x is greater than y and y is greater than z. Or, and takes precedence over or, but we'll draw the parentheses anyway. Z is greater than y and y is greater than x. Each one of these constraints is binary. So we have a way of testing, are each one of these true, and then use more binary to put them together. So you could even label this test 1, test 2, test 3, and test 4. And then you have a way of saying, now we can say test 1 and test 2. That's binary, either yes or no. And test 3 and test 4, that's binary. And then you could label the combination of these tests, test 5 and test 6. And then you could say test 5 or test 6. And you kind of have a recursive definition of a way of breaking a problem down into further problems. And you can show with logic that you can take any arbitrarily complicated constraint over more than two variables and represent them as just a set of constraints over two variables. And sometimes that's simpler than trying to think of the constraint in terms of way more variables than that. That makes sense? Questions on that? I can tell people really want to go home. I'll finish this slide that's literally that much. I gave an example. So the all diff constraint on Sudoku is kind of an extreme version of this, but all diff was one of those n-ary constraints that scales to the size of the Sudoku, as long as it's a 9x9 Sudoku. Converting that all diff into a set of binary constraints, that would be a lot of work, but it's possible. Cell 1 is different from cell 2. Cell 1 is different from cell 3. Cell 1 is different from cell 4. Every single pair along that line is going to be its own binary constraint, but you could do it. So we will come back on Thursday. We didn't quite get to the point where I can introduce project 2 yet. That's fine. There's a little bit of time left for project 1 anyway. And we'll come back and talk about, we'll recap node consistency, start talking about arc consistency, which allows us to reduce the domain even further. And then how we can effectively solve constraint problems with search. So we'll do that on Thursday.